One country has more construction cranes working today than the rest of the world has sitting idle. At first glance, that sounds like one of those statistics designed to win an argument on social media. It isn't. Even if the exact number changes from month to month, and it does, the underlying reality is remarkably difficult to dispute. China has become the largest construction site in modern history, and the cranes are simply the easiest part to count. The strange thing is that people often look at those cranes and assume they're measuring a property bubble. They're measuring something much bigger. A tower crane doesn't appear because somebody poured concrete yesterday. Months before it arrives, land has to be acquired, steel has to be produced, financing has to be approved, machinery has to be manufactured, logistics have to function, and thousands of workers have to be coordinated. By the time a crane rotates over a skyline, an entire industrial ecosystem has already been moving for months. That's why this matters far beyond China's real estate sector. Because the same factories producing tower cranes also manufacture port equipment, wind turbines, shipyard gantries, bridge components, mining machinery, and heavy industrial systems exported across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and increasingly the Middle East. Construction isn't operating in isolation. It's connected to manufacturing in ways that many discussions simply ignore. Consider one figure. China produced well over 1 billion tons of crude steel in recent years, more than half of global output. That steel doesn't disappear into spreadsheets. It becomes apartment towers, high-speed rail bridges, offshore wind farms, industrial parks, factories, and container terminals. Every crane you see represents thousands of tons of material that somebody had to melt, transport, and assemble. And this is where the story becomes less obvious. For years, the dominant assumption in many Western policy circles was that China's construction boom would eventually collapse under its own weight. There were good reasons for that expectation. Property developers accumulated enormous debts. Companies like Evergrande became symbols of excess. Local governments relied heavily on land sales. Empty apartment complexes became international headlines. Those problems are real. But here's the question that deserves more attention. What happens if everyone has been watching the wrong cranes? Because while residential construction slowed sharply after 2021, another pattern accelerated. Investment increasingly shifted toward advanced manufacturing, energy infrastructure, logistics hubs, semiconductor facilities, electric vehicle supply chains, and industrial upgrades supported by Beijing's central government. The skyline changed. The industrial base didn't stop expanding. In fact, China's National Development and Reform Commission wasn't simply trying to keep construction alive. It was directing capital towards sectors expected to strengthen long-term productive capacity. Battery plants appeared. Solar manufacturing expanded. New ports were upgraded. High-voltage transmission networks stretched across provinces. Factory complexes replaced many speculative housing projects. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Building apartments creates wealth only if people want to buy them. Building manufacturing capacity changes what a country can produce for decades. They're not the same investment. There's another detail that often gets overlooked. China doesn't merely use cranes, it builds them. Companies such as XCMG, Zoomlion, and Sany have become some of the world's largest manufacturers of heavy construction equipment. Every additional project strengthens domestic suppliers, hydraulic manufacturers, electronics firms, steel producers, and engineering companies. The construction sector becomes a customer for Chinese industry itself. It's an unusually self-reinforcing system. There's a dry irony here. Many countries debate whether to subsidize manufacturing. China often creates the demand first, then lets its manufacturers compete to supply it. Different philosophy, different outcome. None of this means China has solved its economic problems. Youth unemployment remains a concern. Local government debt is substantial. Demographic trends are unfavorable. Property inventories are still weighing on parts of the economy. These aren't minor issues, and anyone claiming otherwise is simplifying a very complicated picture. But neither does it mean the broader industrial engine has stalled. Those are two separate questions, and separating them is where the analysis begins to get interesting. Because once you stop treating cranes as symbols of real estate and start treating them as indicators of industrial mobilization, a very different picture starts to emerge. The surprising part is that construction itself isn't the biggest story. It's who is making the machines doing the construction, and that's where the numbers become much harder to ignore. The assumption that China simply builds too much has become one of those ideas that survives because it's partly true. There are empty apartments. There are underused developments. There are cities where supply clearly ran ahead of demand. But if you stop there, you miss the mechanism. Think about what happened after the global financial crisis in 2008. While many governments focused on stabilizing banks, Beijing launched an enormous infrastructure program worth roughly 4 trillion yuan. Roads, railways, power stations, airports, ports, projects appeared almost simultaneously across the country. Critics argued it created debt. Supporters argued it prevented mass unemployment. Both were right. The stimulus left China with financial problems it is still working through. Yet it also left the country with engineering firms capable of delivering projects at a scale almost nobody else could match. Skills compound just as capital does. Once you've built hundreds of bridges, tunnels, and metro systems, the 1,000th project becomes cheaper, faster, and less risky than the first. Experience becomes infrastructure of its own. This is where cranes become a misleading visual. People see a machine lifting steel beams. They don't see the supply chain behind it. Take a single large tower crane. Before it reaches a construction site, high-grade steel has passed through rolling mills. Hydraulic cylinders have been manufactured to extremely tight tolerances. Electronic control systems have been assembled, bearings sourced, electric motors tested, and thousands of components inspected. Logistics companies transport sections that weigh several tons each. Engineers certify assembly. Operators undergo specialized training. A crane is less a machine than the final signature of an industrial ecosystem. China spent decades building that ecosystem. Look at the companies leading it. XCMG began as a regional machinery factory before becoming one of the world's largest construction equipment manufacturers. SANY grew from producing welding materials into a multinational heavy machinery company, selling excavators, cranes, and concrete pumps on nearly every continent. Zoomlion followed a similar trajectory, expanding through engineering equipment and industrial automation. These firms aren't successful because China builds a lot. China builds a lot partly because firms like these exist. Cause and effect often get reversed. The same pattern appears in ports. Shanghai's Yangshan deepwater port isn't simply a place where containers arrive. It's connected to domestic manufacturers, inland rail corridors, automated logistics systems, and export networks that move products with extraordinary efficiency. Build enough ports, and shipping companies adjust their routes, improve those routes, and manufacturers invest nearby. Those manufacturers then generate more cargo, justifying further port expansion. Each piece reinforces the next. There's an economic concept called cumulative advantage. Once a system reaches sufficient scale, every additional investment becomes more productive because it plugs into infrastructure that already exists. China has spent nearly 3 decades creating exactly that environment. The counterargument deserves attention because it isn't weak. Economists outside China frequently point to diminishing returns. They argue that adding another industrial park or another logistics center eventually contributes less to growth than the previous one. They also note that debt-funded investment cannot continue indefinitely if productivity fails to keep pace. Those concerns are legitimate. The question is whether China has actually crossed that line. The evidence is mixed. Residential property almost certainly did. Manufacturing appears to tell a different story. Between electric vehicles, battery production, solar panels, and increasingly sophisticated industrial robotics, capacity isn't merely expanding, it is shifting into sectors Beijing identifies as strategically important. Programs linked to initiatives such as Made in China 2025, despite international criticism, helped redirect investment toward advanced manufacturing rather than relying solely on housing-led growth. That transition wasn't smooth. It wasn't supposed to be. Replacing a real estate engine that accounted for roughly a quarter of economic activity is comparable to replacing one of 4 engines on an aircraft while it's still flying. Progress was never going to look elegant. One detail rarely receives enough attention. Construction cranes themselves have become an export. Chinese manufacturers increasingly sell heavy lifting equipment throughout Southeast Asia, Africa, the Gulf states, and Latin America, often accompanying broader infrastructure projects financed by Chinese banks or executed by Chinese engineering firms. In other words, China isn't just exporting buildings, it's exporting the ability to build. That's a much more durable business. Remember the opening observation? That cranes represent an industrial system rather than isolated construction sites? There's another layer to that idea. Because if Chinese cranes are appearing across foreign skylines, they aren't only measuring China's domestic economy anymore. They're beginning to measure something much larger. And that changes how we should think about what these machines actually represent. The conversation up to this point almost invites a simple conclusion. China built more factories, more ports, more railways, therefore China wins. I don't think it's that simple. Because industrial capacity only matters if someone wants what you're producing. That brings us to the reversal. China's greatest strength has also become one of its biggest vulnerabilities. The country's industrial machine has become so productive that domestic demand alone can't absorb everything it makes. Steel mills don't just need Chinese construction projects. Battery factories don't only need Chinese drivers. Solar manufacturers aren't depending solely on rooftops in Shanghai or Shenzhen. Their business models increasingly assume customers somewhere else, which means exports stop being a bonus. They become essential. Look at electric vehicles. Chinese companies like BYD have expanded at extraordinary speed, supported by an ecosystem of battery suppliers, electronics manufacturers, and mineral processing that few competitors can match. The result isn't simply cheaper cars, it's production capacity on a scale that forces every global automaker to rethink pricing. European manufacturers noticed. American policymakers noticed. Governments that barely mentioned Chinese EVs 5 years ago are now debating tariffs, subsidies, and industrial policy almost monthly. That's not because China suddenly became good at making cars. It's because the production volume reached a point where it could reshape international markets. The same pattern exists in solar panels. For years, many Western producers struggled to compete with Chinese manufacturers that benefited from scale, integrated supply chains, and lower production costs. Today, China dominates much of the global solar manufacturing chain, from polysilicon processing to finished modules. That has helped make renewable energy cheaper worldwide. It has also made many countries uncomfortable. Dependence creates leverage. Not always political leverage, but certainly economic leverage. This is where the discussion usually becomes polarized. One side argues China is flooding markets with artificially cheap products supported by state subsidies. The other argues consumers benefit from lower prices and faster technological adoption. There's truth in both positions. State support has unquestionably played a role. Institutions such as the China Development Bank and various provincial financing vehicles have provided capital on terms many foreign competitors simply cannot access. Local governments frequently compete to attract manufacturers through land, tax incentives, and infrastructure. That's difficult to replicate in market economies where multiple political cycles shape investment decisions. Yet subsidies alone don't explain what happened. If they did, every subsidized industry around the world would dominate globally. Most don't. Scale matters, execution matters, supply chain coordination matters. Those advantages are much harder to copy than writing a government check. Consider batteries. China doesn't only assemble them, it refines much of the lithium, processes large quantities of graphite, manufactures cathode and anode materials, produces battery cells, and increasingly controls recycling capacity. Each stage lowers costs for the next. Remove one link and the chain still functions. Remove several and the economics change entirely. That's why bringing manufacturing back home has proven more complicated than political speeches suggest. Building a factory is relatively straightforward. Building the network around the factory can take decades. There's another misconception worth examining. People often imagine industrial competition as a race between countries. Increasingly, it's a race between ecosystems. A semiconductor fabrication plant isn't competitive because of the building itself. It's competitive because chemical suppliers, precision equipment manufacturers, universities, logistics providers, software developers, and skilled engineers all exist within reach. The same principle applies to heavy industry. An isolated factory produces goods. An ecosystem produces industries. China spent years assembling ecosystems. The United States still possesses extraordinary strengths in advanced semiconductors, aerospace, software, pharmaceuticals, and cutting-edge research. Europe retains world-class engineering, industrial automation, and specialized manufacturing. Japan continues to lead in precision equipment and advanced materials. This isn't a story where one side becomes good and everyone else suddenly becomes irrelevant. Reality almost never works that way. But the balance is shifting, quietly. Remember the cranes from the opening? They were never really the point. The cranes were simply the visible evidence that capital, materials, engineering talent, and political priorities were all moving in the same direction at the same time. Most countries excel at one or two of those variables. Aligning all four consistently is exceptionally rare. Here's the question I keep coming back to. If construction cranes were the world's easiest industrial indicator to ignore, what indicators are we overlooking today that will seem obvious 10 years from now? That question may matter even more than the cranes themselves. There's a sentence you'll hear often whenever China's economy comes up. They built too much. There's truth in it, but it also hides a much more important question. Too much? Compared to what? Compared to today's demand? Perhaps. Compared to what the world will need over the next 20 years? I'm not convinced. History has a habit of making excess look like foresight. In the 19th century, Britain was accused of laying unnecessary railways. After the Second World War, America built interstate highways that many critics considered extravagantly expensive. Japan was mocked in the 1960s for building industrial capacity beyond immediate demand. A generation later, those investments looked very different. I'm not saying history will repeat itself. It rarely does. I'm saying timing matters. China appears willing to accept years of lower returns today if it believes the industrial base will matter more tomorrow. Whether that proves wise depends on one variable no central planner can fully control: the rest of the world's demand. If global trade fragments into competing blocks, excess capacity becomes expensive. If electrification accelerates, data centers multiply, developing economies continue urbanizing, and energy infrastructure expands, today's overcapacity may simply become tomorrow's supply. That's the bet Beijing seems to be making, and it is a remarkably large bet. Personally, I think too much analysis treats China's economy as if it's a quarterly earnings report. It's not. The leadership in Beijing routinely talks in decades rather than election cycles. That doesn't mean they'll succeed. It does mean they're solving a different optimization problem than many Western governments. The question isn't, will next year's GDP growth reach 5%? It's closer to, what industrial position will China occupy in 2040? Those are completely different questions. Of course, planning doesn't eliminate risk. Demographics remain difficult. China's working-age population has begun to decline. Local government finances are under sustained pressure after years of relying on land sales. Household confidence has weakened since the property downturn. International trade tensions continue to intensify, with tariffs, export controls, and investment restrictions becoming increasingly common. None of those challenges disappear because more cranes are operating. In fact, they become more significant. An industrial machine this large requires markets, capital, innovation, and political stability to keep moving. Lose any one of those for long enough, and even the strongest manufacturing base begins to slow. That brings me to the doubt I can't shake. Can the rest of the world realistically rebuild industrial capacity at the pace politicians now promise? We're hearing ambitious announcements from Washington, Brussels, New Delhi, and elsewhere. Semiconductor fabs, battery plants, shipyards, strategic minerals, domestic manufacturing. Almost every major economy now talks about industrial resilience. Talking is the easy part. Building the suppliers, training engineers, expanding power grids, modernizing ports, and creating complete industrial ecosystems is measured in decades, not press conferences. That's why I think the crane comparison matters. Not because cranes are magical, because they reveal something that's incredibly difficult to fake. You can subsidize a factory. You can't instantly subsidize 30 years of accumulated engineering experience. You can announce an industrial policy. You can't announce millions of skilled workers into existence. Industrial capacity compounds, just like financial capital. Every completed bridge teaches engineers something. Every factory improves suppliers. Every port attracts more logistics companies. Every generation trains the next. After enough years, momentum becomes its own competitive advantage. And momentum is what much of the world underestimated. Remember the opening claim? China has more cranes operating than the rest of the world has parked. Whether that exact comparison remains true next year isn't actually the point. The cranes are just the visible evidence. The real story is the industrial system beneath them. Steel mills, machinery manufacturers, logistics networks, engineering firms, financing institutions, and long-term planning, all moving in the same direction. That's considerably harder to measure and even harder to replicate. My prediction is this. Over the next decade, the competition between major powers will become less about who invents the next breakthrough technology and more about who can manufacture that breakthrough at scale. History rewards invention, markets reward production. The countries that combine both will shape the global economy. We'll find out whether China has built too much or whether everyone else has built too little. If you enjoyed this analysis, I'd appreciate you joining me for the next one. The headlines tell you what's happening. The interesting part is figuring out why.